Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jeremiah, and I'm here to discuss everything there is to know about fantasy football. And this concludes the fantasy season for some people. And when you conclude the season literally this time this week, it pretty much means you either lost or you won your championship in the fantasy league. So congrats to all those guys or girls who won their championship in their fantasy league, and to those guys and girls that lost in the finals or in the playoffs. I would say there's always next year. Better luck next year. There's always time to get better, and you got a whole year to replicate. You got a whole year to get better. You got a whole year to perhaps make another playoff run. And to those who didn't make the playoffs this year, I would say good luck to you guys next year. And remember, there's always next year. It's always next year. All you have to do is do some homework, do some research, and maybe you can happen to draft really well. And who knows? Who knows? But to begin today's show, I'm going to talk about last night's Monday Night Football game like I do with every show of the week. The Dallas Cowboys really dismantled the Detroit Lions 42-21, and there was a lot of the best way I can say this is that there wasn't many fantasy performances from the Detroit Lions side. So Matthew Stafford, who is one of the top fantasy quarterbacks this year, he didn't finish the year off really well. He only had 260 yards passing and 1 interception. So, yeah, he didn't do a whole lot in this game, and I do expect him to bounce back next year. But he's had a really good year. He's had a really, really good year with the Lions. This was the first year without Megatron. Remember that. And he had an incredible year. The kid he was talking about, he was in the discussion for MVP. He finishes the fantasy season with 3,980 yards passing and 22 touchdowns. And remember, this actual season is not over yet, so he has one more week. But to end the year and that kind of note, this is probably one of the best years he's had in a while since the 2011 team and Detroit. And I do like Matthew Stafford going into next year. I like Golden Tate going into next year as well as Marvin Jones. They look like they have chemistry there. And this is, like I said, this is probably his best year since 2011. And remember, 2011, he had like 41 touchdowns. And it was probably the most efficient year he's had. He didn't have like the big stats like he's always used to, but this is probably the most efficient year he's ever had. Remember, this is probably the best. He had a career high in completion percentage, so he didn't have like that flashy season, but this is the most efficient year he's ever had. I've ever seen him as a quarterback, and I do expect him to have that efficiency with more next year. But a player that was really under the radar this week, I didn't get to talk about a whole lot this year, was Zach Zenner, the running back for Detroit. He had a really good game. 67 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had a really good game on the ground. He also added 25 yards receiving. So he had close to 80 yards total. But, Zach Zenner was probably the best game by running back I've seen all year. Theoretic has had a couple good games this year with over 100 yards total. But from a pure running back standpoint, that was probably the best game of a rusher in Detroit. Dwayne Washington didn't do a whole lot. He had 22 yards on 7 carries. And then Matthew Stafford did have a touchdown on the ground. But this Detroit backfield was just all over the place this entire year. Theoretic was going through a lot of injury problems this year. Dwayne Washington could have had an even bigger role if he didn't get hurt. Zach Zenner was really inconsistent, but he did have he looked really good running the football yesterday. I do to say who was going to be the lead running back for the Lions next year. I'm going to have to go with Amir Abdullah, but remember he is going to come off an Achilles injury, so he's someone they have to take really a lot of caution off. But next year, I don't like any of the Detroit Lions running backs. I would probably say Amir Abdullah is probably going to be the lead guy, but remember he's coming off an injury. Theo Riddick is always hurt. Dwayne Washington's always hurt. I don't even know if Zach Zenner is going to be on the team, which is a shame because he was pretty good. So it's just a wait and see approach for the Lions backfield heading into next year. And for the receivers in Detroit, Eric Ebron had the best game out of anybody in the receiving corps last night for Detroit. Eric Ebron finished with 93 yards on 12 targets. He did have 8 receptions. I do think he is going to be one of the top tight ends next year. I think he's going to be a top 10 tight end. I don't know if I can put him in the top 5 yet, but he looks like he was trending to being a tight end 1. And I do expect a big year from Eric Ebron next year for fantasy purposes. Golden Tate finished with 58 yards on 6 targets. I do expect Golden Tate to have a really good year next season. He did have a very slow start. It took him a while to get going, but I do think next year he's going to have a really good bounce back year. And Marvin Jones, he didn't end the year off like he started. He did have 16 yards on 1 reception. He did have 7 targets, but it just wasn't enough. I do expect Marvin Jones to have a really big year again. As long as the Lions throw the football a lot, I do like their receivers. That's why I don't really trust a lot of the running backs because they're a pass-first team. As long as they're a pass-first team and Matthew Stafford's healthy, I like Eric Ebron, Golden Tate, and Marvin Jones heading to next year. As for the Cowboys, what else do I have to say? Dak Prescott was efficient as can be. Probably the most efficient game he's had as a pro. He did finish with 212 yards and 3 touchdowns. Dez Bryant was probably the best fantasy player yesterday in this game. Dez Bryant finished the game with 70 yards on 5 targets and 4 receptions and 2 touchdowns. And he had a passing touchdown. That went for 10 yards. So he had 3 total touchdowns. He had 80 total yards. And that's a pretty good game in my book. I do think that's a pretty good game. As far as for Dak Prescott, he does end the year off on a really good note. I do think he's going to be someone that's going to be a top 15, top 10 quarterback next year. I think he's going to be even better because I think Ezekiel Elliott's going to be even better, who finished yesterday with 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. So another strong performance for Ezekiel Elliott. Derek McFadden even got in all the fun. He had 49 yards rushing. So, I do think Ezekiel Elliott and Dak Prescott are 2 guys that are going to be, I think they're going to be drafted in a lot of leagues next year. I think Dak Prescott might be kind of overrated a little bit next year, but I do think he's going to be drafted next year for sure. And Ezekiel Elliott, I do think he's going to be easily a top 3 pick. And it's going to be tough who's going to have that top number 1 pick. I think it's going to be between Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson, and Ezekiel Elliott for the number 1 pick. I would prefer we go Le'Veon Bell if he's not suspended again. But those are the 3 top guys that are going to be vying for the number 1 pick next year. And Dez Bryant, I already talked about him. He had a really big game with 70 yards receiving, 2 touchdowns. Through the air, he did have a passing touchdown. I went for 10 yards. Terrence Williams had a pretty solid game with 61 yards on 4 targets. Jason Witten did end the year off with a touchdown, but only mustered up 33 yards. And Bryce Butler had the other touchdown for the Cowboys. He only had 1 score for 21 yards. But yeah, I do expect Dez Bryant to be among the top receivers again next year. I don't know if he's going to be on the Cowboys. There was some talk about him getting traded, but I think no matter wherever Dez Bryant goes, he's going to be a top 5, top 10 receiver anywhere. He's just really that good. But that concludes. That concludes this segment. And in our next segment, when we come back, I'm going to talk about this week's top performers in Week 16. So I will have that for you guys when we come back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And it's time to discuss this week's top performers of Week 16. And we had a whole lot of them. We had a lot of players that scored over 30 points, over 20 points. This was a big week. This was a really huge week. What happened to this production throughout the whole year? That's what I got to say. That's all I got to say. But anyways, the top performer that we have this week is none other than Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers. He just absolutely put on the show against the Minnesota Vikings defense. He finished the day with 347 yards, 4 touchdowns through the air. He even had a touchdown on the ground. So, yeah, it's another big day for Aaron Rodgers there and Green Bay. And, I think he's going to be a top 5 quarterback heading to next year again. Russell Wilson ended the fantasy season on a good note. He actually finished, exactly 350 yards passing with 4 touchdowns. And he also converted a 2-point conversion and also added 36 rushing yards. So I think Russell Wilson, he started slow and then he played well. And then as the season went on, he got healthier, then he played better. And he ended the year on a good note. And I do expect Russell Wilson to be a top 10 quarterback next year. He just looks like he keeps growing every year as a quarterback. And I do expect him to be even better next year, which is scary, talking about the Seahawks there. But our top performer in the receiver group is Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen and the Minnesota Vikings. Yes, he had a really big day against the Green Bay Packers. He finished the day with 202 yards receiving and 12 receptions on 15 targets, and also added 2 touchdowns. So a big day there for the Minnesota receiver. It looks like he has a really good chemistry with Sam Bradford. I don't know if Sam Bradford's going to be back. It looks like Teddy may have to miss more time if he happens to miss more time next year. Sam Bradford looks like he has a really good chemistry with Adam Thielen. And if Sam Bradford is a quarterback again next year, which I don't know if it's going to happen, but let's just say if Sam Bradford is there, Adam Thielen is going to be a really good receiver to target in the later rounds. I think he's a solid receiver 2, receiver 3. He looked like he finished the year stronger than Stephon Diggs did. Stephon Diggs looked like I think Stephon Diggs is the best receiver, but Adam Thielen was the most productive receiver this year. And I do expect him to be a solid receiver again next year. Tyrod Taylor finished the year off really good. He did have 329 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, and added 60 yards on the ground. So he had more than 400 total yards. And it was a big way. He had a big game to end the year. And the Buffalo Bills offense mustered up over 500 yards. And they still lost. So, I do expect whoever is the coach for the Bills, because they did fire Rex Ryan earlier this morning. I do expect Tyrod Taylor to bounce back. He's shown flashes at times, and it's just a matter of him putting it all together. And they have one of the best running backs in the league, in LaShawn McCoy. So I do expect Tyrod Taylor to have a pretty solid year again next season. But I don't know if he's going to get drafted very highly. Kirk Cousins, someone I think he's going to be on a lot of drafts next year, who's going to be a lot of rosters after the drafts, that is. Finished the year off with 270 yards passing, 1 touchdown through the air, and he also added 2 touchdowns on the ground. And, he was a big part of the Redskins' huge win over Chicago. They did finish that game 41-21 as the Redskins are fighting for the playoff lives. Kirk Cousins looks like he is the quarterback there in Washington. And if Cousins doesn't come back to the Redskins, I think no matter where he goes, I think he will have a very productive season. It just depends on the team around him. And David Johnson, one of the top running backs this year, he played another great game. He was a huge part in the Cardinals' victory against the Seahawks. He had 95 rushing yards and 41 yards receiving. He did have 3 touchdowns in the game, and he had 1 fumble. He did lose a fumble. But, David Johnson did something very incredible this year. He tied the record with 15 straight games of 100-plus yards of offense. So that means 100-plus yards from the line of scrimmage. He tied Barry Sanders, who did it in the 1997 season. So David Johnson has been one of the best running backs. He can do it all. He can honestly be one at the MVP this year, which I will get to at the end of the show. But like I said, it's between Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson, and Ezekiel Elliott as the top 3 running backs, probably the top 3 picks in drafts next year. But, like I said, David Johnson was just a man possessed this year. Jordy Nelson continues his comeback year, coming off ACL surgery or injury. He finished the fantasy season with 154 yards receiving, 2 touchdowns. He finished the year with 14. So another strong year from Jordy Nelson. He's probably going to be even better next year because he's probably going to be even more healthier, which is scary. But Jordy Nelson, I think he is a top 5 receiver in the game. He doesn't get a lot of credit, and I do think he will finish. He will be a top 5 receiver, top 10 receiver, and fantasy next year. And, I got to talk about a couple of other players here. Colin Kaepernick actually finished the year off on a good note. After he started the year on a really strong note, he kind of went on a little mini slump there, but, he finished strong with 266 yards passing. He had 2 touchdowns. He did have a rushing touchdown, and he had a 2-point conversion. Remember, he refs for that 2-point conversion, so he had a strong day. And it's tough for me to see how Colin Kaepernick is going to be in fantasy next year. I don't know if he's going to be with the Niners. Even if he is, I don't expect him to win a lot. But if he does stay with the Niners, I do like him in this Chip Kelly offense. He does put up really good numbers. If the Niners happen to find better pieces around them this offseason. If they happen to get better at the receiving group, I like Colin Kaepernick as a top 15, top 10 quarterback. But having him as a top 5, that's a bit of a stretch. But if the Niners find a way to build around Kaepernick this offseason, and Kaepernick does happen to stay in San Francisco, I kind of like Colin Kaepernick as a sleeper at the quarterback position. And I gotta talk about Jay Ajayi. Another great game. He finished the game this weekend against the Buffalo Bills, 206 yards and a touchdown. So that gives him over 400 yards of total rushing yards against Rex Ryan's defense in Buffalo, who was fired earlier this morning. And Andrew Luck, he had a really good game against the Raiders. He was falling behind, but he almost got his team back within one. He almost got his team back to tie the game, but unfortunately, the Raiders hold off the Colts as they won 33-25. But as for Andrew Luck, he did have 288 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, did throw 2 picks, but had a rushing score, which gives him 3 total, and converted a 2-point conversion. But as far as other top performers, we had Le'Veon Bell, who of course finished the year off with 122 rushing yards and a score on the ground and 15 receiving yards and a score through the air against the Baltimore Ravens. And Dak Prescott, his huge game yesterday, 212 yards and 3 touchdowns. And 300 Washington of the Oakland Raiders finished with 99 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns. And Doug Baldwin finished the year in a huge way, receiving 171 yards and 1 touchdown against the Arizona Cardinals. So it looks like I think Doug Baldwin's going to have a big year next year. He kind of came back down to earth a little bit, but I do expect him to come back in a big way next season. But that concludes this week's top performers. And when we come back, I'm going to discuss who I think should be the MVP of the fantasy season. I got 3 players. I've already mentioned them numerous times already, so I think you guys know who I'm going to go with here. But I'm going to talk about 3 specific players who I think is going to be the MVP, who I think is going to be the number 1 pick in next year's draft. I think you kind of guys know where I'm going with this. But yeah, I will have that for you guys when we come back at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And I'm going to talk about 3 specific players here that have really strong fantasy seasons. Who is the MVP of fantasy football this year? I think it's between 3 players. 1, David Johnson's in that group. 2, Le'Veon Bell's in that group. And 3, Ezekiel Elliott's in that group. These are 3 guys that really scored 20 points on the bad day. So you can always count on these 3 specific players. And David Johnson always gets at least 100 yards every game, no matter what. He can get a receiving, rushing, it doesn't matter. He obviously has 15 games over 100 yards. For that, he has to be in the conversation. Le'Veon Bell is the best running back in all football, in my opinion. So that for that, I think he deserves to be in there. Ezekiel Elliott is probably one of the main reasons why the Cowboys are so successful this year. So it's really hard to decide who is the fantasy MVP because, David Johnson did have 100 yards of offense from scrimmage in 15 straight games, and that's hard to do. That is very hard to do. he's the first one to do it at 15 straight games since Barry Sanders. So if he does it one more time on Sunday, he will be the first to do it throughout a whole season. David Johnson, for that, deserves to be the MVP. Le'Veon Bell, ever since he came back from suspension, he's been a beast. He had 1,268 yards so far and 7 touchdowns. If he would have not missed those 3 games, he would have had he would have had probably like up to 1,700 yards. Maybe he would have had definitely over double-digit touchdowns. So for the fact that he's missed games, for the fact that he's missed the first month of the season, for that I can't put him in the category of MVP, but he is the best running back in the game, and I think Le'Veon Bell is the number 1 pick in drafts next year. I think he is the guy to take. As for Ezekiel Elliott, you have to put him in here. He's on pace to crush. He's on pace to be Eric Dickerson's rookie rushing record, which I think he could do in Week 17. He has 1,631 yards rushing, 15 touchdowns. That is crazy. Don't forget, he's also been highly involved in the passing game. He has 363 yards receiving, and he does have a touchdown through the air. So Ezekiel Elliott, he's definitely someone that needs to be in that category. I think he's going to be a top 3 pick next year. But as far as fantasy MVP, I want to say Le'Veon Bell. I want to say Ezekiel Elliott. But for the fact that David Johnson, no matter what, finds ways to get over 100 yards from scrimmage in every game, I think he is the fantasy MVP. Some people are going to disagree with me, and I know. But I think without David Johnson, how is your team going to look? Exactly. He has 16 touchdowns on the ground, 4 touchdowns receiving. He has 841 yards receiving. I wouldn't be surprised if he had over 100 yards, 150 yards receiving against the Rams in Week 17, which probably could happen. I wouldn't be surprised if he had over 150 yards receiving to get close to 1,000 yards receiving. And he does have 1,233 yards rushing. So I do think he's going to have a strong game against the Rams, because, the Cardinals, they're not going to go to the playoffs. They're not going to have a winning season. So they're going to expect to end the year on a high note. I do think David Johnson is going to be a very integral part of the Cardinals offense next year because I do think they're going to bounce back and perhaps maybe be a playoff team. But for the fact that David Johnson, no matter what, finds ways to get yards, no matter what, he finds ways to get 100 yards, no matter what, he's always, and even if he doesn't have a touchdown, he is always going to have a big game yardage-wise. For that only. For that, and if you look at his numbers compared to the other guys, I have to say David Johnson is the fantasy MVP this year. I have to. I got to do it. And if you disagree with me, I don't care. If you just look at the numbers compared to Le'Veon Bell and Ezekiel Elliott, David Johnson completely shatters the yardage numbers. He has more yardage. He has the most yardage of any running back this year. I think of any player, if you put him next to a receiver. So, yeah, for that, I have to say David Johnson is this year's fantasy MVP. But that concludes our show, guys. And if you disagree with me on that, just complain on the Twitter page. That is at GSMC_FFootball. And we also have an Instagram page as well. That is at GSMC_FFootball. You can also like our show on Facebook at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. But, you can also follow the show in a variety of ways. iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, YouTube, the GSMC Podcast website. There's no excuse that you cannot watch our show. There's no excuse that you can't listen to our show. But we will be back. Our schedule is going to be a little different. We are still trying to figure it out. But don't worry, we're not going to go anywhere. We're still going to do the show throughout the season. There is no off season here at the GSMC Podcast Network. We're going to have coverage for you all year long, heading into next year. And yes, it's time to start getting ready for next season, fantasy season. But I'm Jeremiah as always, and I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in, and see you guys next time.